Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Dogs Do Speak. Um, Today we have Dawn Spence. Now, the reason why I stuttered there is because we share the same surname. We're not related, but who knows? You never know. In this world, when you have the same surname as someone else, you really don't know. But today we're going to be talking about nutrition. It's a subject topic that is something I think a lot of us, myself included here, we're not really up on. I don't understand it fully. There's a lot to understand and learn about canine nutrition. Not even just canine nutrition, nutrition for animals, full stop. So today, Dawn's going to enlighten us what that's all about and how we find a nutritionist, etc., etc. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dawn, who's going to tell you how she got into the industry, why she got into the industry, and what she actually does, what services she provides. So, Dawn, thank you for popping along to Dogs Do Speak podcast. Um, it's all yours.
Hello. Hi, thank you for having me. Um, so I work primarily as a trainer behaviurist. So I'll kind of talk then about how nutrition comes into that. But I've been working as a trainer behaviorist. I live down in sunny old Devon, so my company's Pawsitive Canine, but I do also do an online um, training platform with one of my friends as well, which is called the Dog Geeks. So that's always a good one to go on if you want to learn more about nutrition, because there's lots on there. I've been working from a training behavioural perspective for about 8 years now, but only been doing it for, when was the end of lockdown? 4 years? 4 years from a full-time basis. So how I kind of got into it was I've always been into my dogs. So I came from it from probably what I would class as a sports dog background. So I used to show one of my dogs and did various different sports with my dogs. And that's kind of how the nutrition came in. I'll talk about that in a moment. But I used to show one of my Dalmatians, and she had a really bad experience where she was attacked by another dog. And what happened from there is she got really reactive, and it meant we went through the cycle of various different trainers, various different books, programs on TV. I read and watched it all, even, from all the good trainers and behaviorists all the way down to the lowest of the low. And it got to a point where I just felt like I didn't understand my dog. I didn't understand her from a factor that I felt like I really did start with. And from that's when I went on to go and do a course in dog behaviour. And that's how I got into the behaviour training world. And from sort of changing her emotional perspective on life and kind of getting her back to where she was prior, I went on to helping friends and families, dogs and things like that on a kind of not work basis, and then grew into doing it where I am now, realistically. In terms of nutrition, I suppose the nutrition side, I fed my dogs what I would class as a fresh, a raw diet for goodness, 17 years now. So way before it was even like a popular thing, realistically. And I started doing that more from an aesthetic sense, in that I wanted my dogs to look good. So, very different to how I look at nutrition now. At the time, I wanted my dogs to look good. Like I say, I used to show my Dalmatian, so I wanted her to be at, physical, her best. So that's kind of where I got into nutrition to start with. And that's then, since I've come into the behavior world, tailed off into all the realms of behavior. So yeah, that's kind of where I started with it all.
Wow. I mean, silly question time now.
Mm-hmm.
When we see the word nutrition, what does it actually mean?
Oh, see, because this is where I was going to talk in nutrition. To me, I think is the really scary word that makes people go, oh my God, I'm really overwhelmed. And I'm just going to stay in this little bubble of not wanting to branch out and do anything more with my dog or offer advice, if we're working with clients, offer advice. And nutrition is nutrition. It is making sure our dogs hit all the factors and have all the different, making sure they're getting the zinc, the magnesium, all of those things. And that scares people. And actually, when we feed our dogs, there's so much more to it. Well, for me, there is anyway. I suppose I'm saying this, but for me, there is. And to me, it's food. Like, nutrition is food. It is the fuel to keep you going. And there is a very big difference to our dogs surviving and thriving. And I think that when we look at nutrition, we look at our dogs surviving. What do they need to survive and be relatively healthy? But food for me, and looking at it from I suppose this is from maybe like a hippy dippy kind of side of me. Food is a completely different thing. There's like so much more to it, which we can definitely talk about because that's where I get a little bit geeky on it. And not geeky, but yeah, hippy dippy on it, I suppose.
So, how do we know when we're feeding a good diet? How can we tell if our dogs are actually thriving on that diet?
Okay, so when I'm looking at a dog, there's lots of factors that we could look for externally. So, we would be looking at things like, I suppose the biggest one is poo. Poo is like the biggest factor that you can be looking at on your dog and deciding, is there something going on? And that's not always going to be down to diet and so on. But, coat health, are they getting ill with things all the time? Loads of different things. Behavior is probably one of the biggest things I'll be looking at. Any of us that are working in a behavior sense, we should be looking at diet. We should. And even if we don't know enough about it, we should be going, okay, there's things here that look like it's diet. We can pass that on to someone else. So they're the things I would kind of outwardly be looking at. But then there's the other things we can be looking at, like our dog's actual diet. So being able to read the food labels, understanding the dog food industry and how it works, which it's a bit of a scary place. So if we go too deep into it, it gets a little bit scary. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories and things like that within it. But we can kind of those things can all just bounce off of us and disappear. We just need to know how to sensibly read a label. And then there are other things that we can do to then supercharge our dog's diet.
You mentioned labels. I think that's really important because for me, labels don't always tell us the full story. And people don't look at the marketing factor of how labels are sort of, or let's just say you're buying a big bag of kibble and the photo and the picture on the front of it is so appealing that people just pick it up, whiz through with what's in it, and off they go home with it. Would you say the All About Dog Food website, is that helpful?
Absolutely, yes. So I would say the All About Dog Food website for anyone that's kind of, pet dog owners and anyone who's unsure, that's probably the best place at this point in time to go to. The other thing that I would always say to do as well, though, is kind of going off on a tangent now of how I'd supercharge my dog's diet, but actually learning about food, like individual bits of food. So, like, for me as a trainer behaviorist and anyone who's working within a realm of training and behavior, I would always say a really good tip is to take two different foods that a dog could eat. So 2 different meats, for example, or 2 different fruits and veg a week, and research those things and research the benefits that they have on your dog. Because if you did that over a month, that's 8 different foods that the pros and cons to, whether it's beneficial to your dog or not. And you can start to see whether those things are in a dog's diet. You can start to understand by adding those things, would it make my dog's diet better and so on. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But definitely, I think labels are a scary thing. I think marketing food has become so huge, and there's so many on the market. All About Dog Food, like you say, is a good way of weeding out what's good and what's not so good. but also understanding how to read the labels. So realistically, like you just said, what it says on the front of a dog food bag doesn't necessarily have to match what's on the back. And when you actually read the composition, you can kind of go, oh, that's weird. And another thing, some people will be feeding a food, and they'll be feeding that food for however long. And that ingredients list might have changed from the bag that you got a month ago. They may have changed their ingredients the next month. So it's always worth looking at the ingredients list every single time you buy that bag of dog food. Realistically, we are looking for a meat source. We're looking for the first ingredient to be whatever meat source it specifies is on the front of the bag. And we want it to realistically say that that's what it is. So rather than it saying turkey on the front of the bag, for example, if you looked at the back of the bag, you would want it to say turkey meat. You don't want it to say like animal derivatives or so on. And you don't want that ingredient to be way down the list of ingredients.
Yes, because I think that's what a lot of people find. It may say turkey and rice, but what part of the turkey are they actually put in there?
Yeah, yeah.
Because
animal derivatives aren't always, we sometimes think of them. It's not always bad. If you think of when you go to like a natural dog treat shop and you can buy like the feet and the all sorts of horrible bits of an animal that we go, oh, when our dogs eat them. My dogs are currently eating those sorts of things now. It's not always bad, but ideally for a good quality diet, we want there to be a good quality muscle meat as the first level ingredient that's in there.
So earlier you said about behaviors, and there's certain behaviors that you would be working with and you'd think, okay, this is probably down to diet. What sort of behaviors would those be, or that other people would keep an eye out for?
I would say one of the big ones is resource guarding. I think resource guarding stems, obviously there are various other factors for resource guarding, like genetics and things like that, but I think that diet plays a huge role in resource guarding. I think that if their gut is feeling a bit off-piste, that's one of the things that, particularly when it's food resource guarding, I think food resource guarding is one that we see an awful lot of. I do also find things like separation anxiety, dealing with diet can also be a really nice foundation for allowing the dog to. It's really hard because actually there's loads. The gut is literally the second brain. So you could pinpoint diet on pretty much every behavior, because if the gut isn't working as it should, you're not going to be producing all the chemicals that allow for good mood. It's, all your good mood chemicals, your serotonin, your dopamine, your GABA, is all produced, well, the biggest percentage is produced down in the gut. So if that's off-piste, then all the behaviors can go off, on tangents. So all of them, but definitely resource guarding, I would say, is a biggie.
So it's similar mood-wise from what you're saying to, it's great to have a pizza one night or a takeaway or whatever, but if you eat that every night, that sluggish feeling that you've got is sort of similar what you're saying to how our dogs would feel if we were feeding maybe a supermarket brand dog food, the kibble.
Absolutely. And it's because, like I said earlier on, it's the gut is our second brain. So it's, combined, it's the enteric nervous system. So what is happening is down in your gut, you've got like a village of lots of different bacteria. I always like to see it as like, in my head, I imagine it like a little ant farm of all the different things doing their different jobs. So sorry if anyone's squeamish. And if that's working well, it's going to be sending messages to the brain that, everything's going well. Those chemicals of serotonin, dopamine, and GABA, they're all going to be bouncing off the brain and making you feel fantastic. But if it's a little bit off-piste, which various things can send it off-piste, obviously diet being one of the biggest ones, that's not, it's all going to go a little bit skewiff. It's all going to go off-piste. So it's all like a little network. And I think another thing to do some, if you're really geeky, is to look into the gut being the second brain and how they connect. So the vagus nerve is like the messenger. So you've got the little village, vagus nerve is the messenger, and that sends messages to the brain, which is making us feel like, well, let's behave like this, let's feel this way, and so on. So yeah, it's like everything when it comes to behavior.
I'm so glad you touched on the vagus nerve, how it sends the messages, and that the gut is probably, well, not probably, is is a place where if the diet, and it's not always about the diet, but if the diet isn't one of good quality, yeah,
Yeah.
then it will have a massive impact on certain behaviors and how we feel emotionally. And for a lot of people watching this, many will be dog trainers and behaviorists that sort of understand it anyway. But there'll always be people that are going to come onto the podcast and have no idea, like myself. The only research I do is about McDonald's and KFC. So my moods are never in a good place. So it's important that, yeah, the information that you're giving out just a few seconds ago is really, really good. I think one of the other things that tends to be, I get this question a lot: should I feed raw or should I feed kibble?
Okay, so it's a really tricky one because actually a raw food diet can also be done really badly. I would love if everybody could feed a raw food, whole food diet and do it well. I would go, yeah, that's the best thing for every single dog. However, there are going to be so many factors as to why people can't feed a raw food diet. And this is where I do find that the nutrition industry and people giving nutrition advice can be very biased. So yes, in an ideal, ideology, in an ideal world, we would all be feeding all fresh foods, the same as we would to ourselves all the time. But some people aren't going to have freezer space. Some people are going to have an issue with maybe someone living in a household, lowered immune system. The dog might have lowered immune system, so it makes it harder to do those things. So what I would be saying to everyone to do, as well as having a really good baseline diet and understanding labels, using all about dog food, the best thing you can then do for your dog's diet, if you can't feed a whole food diet, is add some supercharged toppers. So adding things to your dog's diet, which are whole foods, and you don't have to go crazy. Like you do see this done sometimes on social media, and sometimes you go, you just actually ruining the entire balance of the diet that was ever there in the first place. It gets a little bit silly sometimes. But, if you think your everyday dog owners that are struggling with certain behaviors and things like that, making sure the baseline is really good quality. And then, 3 times a week, which there has been studies found that adding supercharged toppers 3 times a week can really help brain and other issues in our dog's life. And that can be things like fruit and veg, so fresh fruit and veg. That can be things like fresh meat, offal. It could be tinned sardines, great for like your omega oils and things like that, which is good for your dog's microbiome. It's really hard to say what you can, because there's so much. There's you're better off figuring out what your dog can't they can't eat because it's toxic, than what they can eat, because then you're going to go, oh, there's loads of stuff I can actually add. And what I would say is, if your dog has been on a kibble based diet and they've had that morning and evening for however long term of their life, I would start gradually. So don't go and make your dogs poorly tomorrow and pile everything in there tonight. I would maybe add a little bit of cottage cheese to their diet and see how they cope with that, and maybe add some sardines a few days later and see how they cope with things. And then you can start to increase it from there. You can start to play around and experiment with different things. Things that are really good for your dog's microbiome, which is that bacteria that's sending all the good stuff to your brain, is things that are naturally higher in like your pro and prebiotics. So probiotics are the good bacteria that we can put into our dog's gut, and prebiotics are what feed those bacteria. And some foods that are good for that would be things like tripe. Gross, I know. So green tripe is a really good one. It's also really easily digestible. So if your dogs ever have poorly tummies, tripe is a good way to go. There are certain mushrooms that your dogs can have that are safe for your dogs that they can have, but obviously research them first. But as a good starting point, Pawsitive mushrooms, they're really good. You can add them into your dog's diet. Other things like kefir, I can never say this, kefir. Everyone says it different, don't they? I say kefir, which is like the natural yogurt. That's always a good one. And other fermented foods as well, so like sauerkraut and things like that. Just make sure if you aren't making it yourself, you have a look what's in the ingredients if you're looking in the supermarket. Bone broth as well, cheap and easy, and that's good for so many different things. You know, just adding bone broth to your dog's kibble, that in itself can just supercharge it straight away. And I know there's loads of recipes online for bone broth.
Can I ask, when we say sardines,
Yeah.
I've always had whenever I speak to clients, I always make sure they only use the sardines in oily sardines. Am I right or wrong there?
Yeah, so like if you were feeding it in brine, it's going to be much higher in salt content and things like that. So yeah, we definitely need to be, or like spring water is always a good one, you know, if you're unsure as well, spring water. Because yeah, in brine it can be much higher in salt. But actually there are some things that show that for raw fed dogs, for example, can be really low in having sodium in their diet. So they can be low in salt because they have all this fresh whole food. So there is still that need for having to have sodium in their diet. So as much as brine is probably too high, yeah, I would probably go with something like the oil or spring water or something like that.
I feel like I'm being really quiet in this one because I'm just sort of sitting like, oh, right, tell me more. I'm not sitting making notes, green tripe, bad bellies. like that.
Yeah. And also there's an element of that like that goes down the route of, and I don't know how, but you'll like this. Oh no, you'll like this, Malcolm, but like the Chinese medicine route in that like heals like. So very often that's, I mean, I think it's just as well because it's easily digestible and it's full of nutrients as well. If you just fed just the tripe alone, green tripe, when your dog's poorly, that would probably be enough to give them loads of nutrients. Maybe not all of them, but enough to kind of go, right, well, they're eating something and it stinks, so they're eating it. But yeah, there is the element of that Chinese medicine thing of like feeding like for like. So that can be a factor as well.
You mentioned earlier as well, obviously, when Cash joined in saying how much he loves raw foods in the background.
Yeah.
Mentioned about raw treats. So what type of raw treats or what type of natural treats or what type of treats in general are you sort of recommending to your clients, or do you think that people should add in?
Oh God, there's loads, isn't there, now on the market? Like you look and you can get so much. I think things as well, like your jointy type thing, that sounds really grim, doesn't it? This is me being a veggie, like talking about I feed my dogs raw. Like the jointy type things and things like duck feet and stuff like that are filled with things like chondroitin, collagen, that sort of stuff. So that's really good for your dog's joints and things. There's so many different bits for so many different bits. So I would say your jointy bits are always good. But the other thing I suppose is depends on the dog, because like for some dogs, Cash has to be careful with certain things that he has because he's such a chomper. He will just chomp huge chunks off and swallow it. But I would say if you are doing anything like that, make sure it is something natural. Be conscious of the way your dog eats. But there's nothing in terms of the natural stuff that I would avoid. I would be feeding various different types of the meat. So I would, you know, Cash is currently eating camel skin. And, you know, I would maybe feed duck feet if I was giving them a smaller chew. And another thing I suppose would be thinking about the behavior of your dog, because if you have a resource guarding dog, you're not going to want to give them something that they're going to be taking ages to eat. You're going to want to give them something like a duck foot that they're going to eat in one sitting. So I suppose it varies that on dog, and I would just be mixing it up so that they have, again, that diversity factor, making sure they have diversity.
What about things like, obviously, you always see the posts about, you know, feed your dog rabbit ears, it's a natural wormer, that sort of thing. Or, like, I mean, I'm putting you on the spot here. I could ruin your career with this. Are rabbit ears a natural wormer, or is it more just that it's roughage?
Yeah, it's more just that it's roughage. I don't think there is proven evidence that shows that it's gonna be a natural wormer. And I think that it is a little bit dangerous going down the route of thinking, oh, I'm going to worm my dog by giving them rabbit's ears. Could it prevent it? The same as like pumpkin seeds and stuff like that? Possibly, but it's not going to. Your dog can pick up worms wherever they are, and they're going to affect a microbiome, FYI. And it's one of those things that I wouldn't just rely on those things to get rid of it. It's a bit like if you've ever had, I think people's mentality is the furriness of them is going to go down the gut and brush the gut out, which I think there is a little bit of evidence. But if you think about it, if you've ever had to like grossly unwedge a bit of rabbit ear out your dog's mouth, they're choking on it or something, you feel how slimy it is and gross. I can't see it clearing your dog's gut of worms if they've got like a build-up of worms or something. So I would still be making sure your worm count, I don't worm my dogs, I do worm count them, because I try and keep them as natural as possible. But I would definitely have conversations with your vet about what's best for your dog, like in terms of wormers. I wouldn't say that it's enough to stop them getting worms. Yeah. Sorry, guys.
So thank you for those bits of information there. When a little while ago we just spoke about kibble, we just touched on the kibble.
Yeah.
And like you said, there is so much on the market. It is worse than Netflix. Yeah, it is worse than Netflix.
Yeah.
And it's very confusing. Would you say there is good, bad, and indifferent kibble?
Yes, there are. The rankings of them are like down in the gutter. I wouldn't feed to my worst enemy. I wouldn't feed to my dogs if they were shriveling up and dying, all the way up to some of the like really, really good kibbles. And if you look on the market now, kibble, we think of kibble and raw, but actually there's loads now. You've got cold pressed, dehydrated, freeze dried, lightly cooked meat. There's so many different things on the market now that it doesn't even have to be kibble. And obviously you've got tinned food, tray like food and all that sort of thing. So it doesn't even have to be kibble. You've got so many different options if you're a bit worried about going down the raw route. But in each category, there is the lowest of the low to the highest of the high. So that is where I suppose like websites like All About Dog Food is really good for just kind of weeding out the rubbish, because there is so much rubbish. I would always say supermarkets, to be honest, are probably not the best place to be looking for your dog food, because they tend to, arguably there are the odd supermarket I've walked past and gone, oh, that's not actually too bad, that's an all right one. And there is that element of, again, we can be really staunch, making people feel really guilty, but there might be times when on a budget, people really can only feed a mediocre diet. And I think this is where the nutrition world does get a little bit scary, that it's like, oh, if you do that, you're basically killing your dog. And actually, I'd rather see a fed dog than a starved dog. But again, it's educating our clients and educating people to know that there are other things you can cheaply add. A tin, if you're on a budget, a tin of sardines is maybe going to boost that really mediocre diet a little bit. All right, it's maybe not going to make it fantastic, but it's going to add that little bit of extra in there that your dog didn't necessarily have. So, I don't want to sit here and make out like, with the highest of the high and no one can feed the mediocre, because you might find yourself in that situation. People might. But there are things that you can add to those things. But definitely try and avoid the really low grade ones, because you're going to end up paying more in the long run if you are feeding that.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, whenever I very first had my first dog, I didn't think anything of it. I'd grown up in the 1980s and the 1990s where your dog just ate whatever, ate scraps, ate whatever you got when you were out at the shop. So I kind of did the same with my first dog. And, I'll put myself out there and I'll say, I did feed my dog Bakers. I'll say it. That's a swear word, I know. I did, because it looked so good. It was in a great package. Everyone was buying it. It has, we were talking about marketing. It has great marketing. And I think I was just very, very lucky that my dog didn't end up with any behavior issues, because it certainly was not on a great diet. But I do have a lot of clients who will say things like, but my dog's been on this for, I've had dogs all my life and they've always eaten this and we've never had any issues. What would you sort of say to people who are sort of trying to back up their, not that I'm criticizing them obviously for their choices, but when I'm trying to educate?
It's really tricky when you do find yourself in that, because, and the thing I always say is, well, your Aunt Deirdre might have smoked 80 fags a day, maybe excessive, but they might have smoked God knows how many fags a day and lived till they were in their 90s. It doesn't necessarily mean that their body was in a good position at that. I want my dogs to stay healthy for the entirety of their life. I don't want them to be hitting old age when they get to like 8 or 9. I feel like for a lot of dogs now, we see dogs that are 8 and 9 years old that are old age dogs, and actually 8 or 9 shouldn't be old age. They could still have another, that's halfway through their life realistically. So for me, it's like, yeah, okay, but they might not have had the best, they might not have felt the best, they might not have, had we have given them an optimal diet, would they have gone on for even longer, or would they have felt great until those last like days of their life and so on? So I think, yeah, people can have that argument, but yeah, it's thinking about, yes, that might be the case, but can we make sure our dogs are at their optimal health and all the way through, and joint wise that they're fit and healthy and all of those sorts of things? Because as much as it's about behavior, it is also about the physical side of things. And yeah, it's not going to make them feel great if they are on, not so great diet. And I think as well, it's like, I think of my childhood dog. He used to eat chocolate and stuff. And I'm not, don't go and feed your dogs chocolate, people. But he used to eat chocolate, and he did live till he was like 17. But when I think about it, there are things now that I can go, oh yeah, maybe that thing that he got was that contributed to that, and maybe those lumps and bumps that he wouldn't have got those at that age. So I think, yeah, it's thinking about, did they have things though that were wrong, that we just, it might not have killed them, but it was still there.
Yeah, finances will play a huge part in what people feed their dogs.
Yeah.
So you got the very low end of the scale, and a lot of our clients tend to be in that realm, in that low end. And I always think you're feeding your dog, you're keeping them alive. It is better than not feeding them at all. Yeah, because if we in the industry are always saying all dogs are different, some dogs will thrive on the bakers.
Yeah.
Then when you go and spend £200 on 15 kilos of whatever it might be, they're not so good anymore. Yeah. And it's not doing them any good. It doesn't have the same impact as the lower end. So I think common sense has to prevail.
Yeah.
We need to feed them. But I totally agree. It's the better the diet, the better chance of a longer life. I totally do agree with that. But what about supplements?
Yeah. So I was just going to say that when you're saying that. So for me, it's the diversity factor. I think the biggest misconduct we make to our dogs daily is by feeding them that same bowl morning and night. It's that they need diversity. So like I was saying earlier, add in fresh food and toppers, and you shouldn't have to then add supplements. If you're adding fresh fruits and veg and you're varying it up, so 1 week, and go with the seasons because it's cheaper then, so you can still keep it on a budget by sticking with the seasons, and that's how nature would have intended it to be at one point. So you shouldn't have to supplement a good baseline diet, but you can supercharge it by adding the diversity. And if we don't add diversity, what happens to our dog's gut is it kind of plateaus. So it's like, well, that microbiome, they're all working together and being fine. But if anything comes into the mix, it just kind of goes, oh God, we've fallen to pieces. Like, dog picks up a dodgy crab leg on the beach, eats it, it's got a bit of bacteria in it, and the whole of that microbiome has fallen to pieces, and you've got a poorly dog. Whereas if we are adding some diversity, our dog's gut is going to be more able to cope with that. And I do think that that's where we often see dogs that get, the whole weaning dogs onto a different kibble, for example. You shouldn't have to wean a dog onto a different food. Their gut should be robust enough to cope with various different things going in. But I think we allow for that by just feeding the same thing morning and night.
Gotcha. Yeah, that bit I wasn't aware of. I am now.
Yeah, variety and diversity. If there's one thing any of you take away, variety, diversity, getting that in there.
So we've got kibble, regardless of what end it's coming from.
Yeah.
Lots of people mix it with water. I just go, what are you doing? Are they doing something wrong or right?
It's not really wrong. It doesn't, I suppose it hydrates the dog as they're eating. I do suppose that dogs that are on a kibble diet are going to have to drink a lot more. Like, there's sometimes a vet asked me a while back there was something with my dog, and they were like, how much do they drink? And I'm like, God, barely anything. Like, I barely fill my dog's water bowl. And granted, they do drink out muddy puddles and stuff on water. They like to do that more than their bowl. But I think because they get a lot of the moisture in their diet, whereas a kibble-fed dog, they do need that added moisture. So I suppose it's not going to harm them. It doesn't really add any extra, but it's also not going to harm them if they are drinking some water with it as well.
Okay. See, I've learned something there, because I was thinking that they were actually ruining the food.
No, I would, again, if it's a decent base, all the nutrients will stay there. It will just float around in the water instead. It's not any harm. And if they wanted to make it supercharged, instead of putting water, they could add bone broth. So they're instead of the water, make yourself some bone broth, cheap and easy, stores in your freezer, add that to your dog's diet instead.
So I'd rather the dog than me, because I'd really hate it if someone came and poured a glass of water over my fried steak.
Yeah. But I suppose that's again, thinking about food. So like I was saying earlier, to me, nutrition isn't all about nutrition from what we're feeding sense. For me, it's all about how we feel about food and things like that. So and I think that behavior, when it comes to microbiome, there is a bit of a chicken or egg scenario. So as much as microbiome can affect the way we behave, the way we feel sometimes. So if we are living in a high level of stress, if we are bored all the time, we're not stimulated enough, that's also going to affect down in the gut. So it's like a chicken or egg scenario of what came first. And I think that the way we feed our dogs also causes a huge issue, but this is kind of an opinion-based thing. I think that we're very controlling with food as humans, and I don't mean that in we're all being horrible, nasty people and intentionally doing it, but I think that by feeding our dog the same thing day out, and by feeding them at same times, and almost restricting everything around food, when for me, food is like something that brings people together, it's nurturing, it's all of those feel-good things. If you think about some of the best meals you've ever had, it's probably been around family and friends and things like that. And I think we restrict that side of food for our dogs massively by making it, right, well, it's 7 o'clock, I've got to feed my dog. And here's your bowl, there it is. And I think we also do it with enrichment feeders, I want some, like I'm doing now, I want some spare time where I've got peace and quiet. There's your food, I'm going to disappear over here. Whereas actually, another thing I would say for people to do is go and forage with your dogs. So this could be obviously something safe that you can both eat. Blackberries, for example. Go for a walk when it's blackberry season and hang out with your dog and actually look like you're hunting with them. So be like, oh, look, what's this? And rummage through the bushes and then eat blackberries together, forage together. Your dog's going to think you're the coolest thing in the world because you've just found food with them. It's better than any other enrichment thing that you could possibly offer your dog, because you're now scavenging with your dog. You're doing what nature intended, but you're also having that bonding time. And I think that we forget that. Or go out and have a picnic with your dog. Take something really delicious with you and with your dog and actually have a bonding time of eating food together. Because we don't do that enough with our dogs. We control food. And I think that can cause an issue with behavior issues as well.
Yeah, because it is it's a bonding thing for dogs to go out together, isn't it, and doing things together. So it would make sense that it's bonding for, both of us. So you would say, I'm guessing from that if, right, okay, we're sitting down to have a family dinner, then the dogs have their dinners and we have our family dinner sort of all at the same time, so that everyone's sort of eating like a social. It's more of a social.
And dogs do. We know that they eat socially, like in wild groups. We know, like, other wild, I know they're not wolves, and from a behaviour perspective, we don't like the same as wolves. But from a feeding perspective, and there are studies out there that show that, and I can send the links to studies and things, that dogs have been known to share with other dogs, usually dogs that they know. But there has been studies that have done, and they will choose to share bits of food if their friend didn't have a piece of food and they had some food. So that to me is a massive like social thing that we're missing out on with our dogs, by just feeding them like, there's your bowl, there it is, or using food for training and not thinking about it in that social perspective.
Wow.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, you've said, I wouldn't have thought of it, but now that you're saying it, I'm like, that really does make sense. If you're only using, say, your dog's on kibble, and you're only using the kibble for training, so they're never getting that sort of meal, it's just all their food is training food, and you're sitting down, they're missing that whole social bonding part of the day, really, aren't they? It's almost like if you have, instead of sitting and having a meal with your kids around the table, you're sitting on the sofa and you're not bonding. It's not quite the same, is it? It's not the same experience.
Yeah. And I think, like I say, we put so much control on food, because then you have the concept of trainers that say to hand feed your dogs everything, to mean that, the food is more valuable. And I suppose to a degree there's that social side in their head, there's that social side to it. But I feel like the dog is constantly then having to work for the food. And imagine if you were like going to get your dinner at night and your partner was like, right, do this, do this, do this. You'd be like, no, I just want to bloody get my food. I do think that there's a lot of control put on food as the humans, and we forget the social side of it. And if you think as well, like for me, the way we think that dogs were domesticated, there would have been a huge element. Sorry, I'm going to get the next appeasement thing for my dog. There would have been an element of social feeding then, I think. If we think of like dogs were helping the groups that they, dogs would come into the groups, people were feeding them, they started to come in and become more domesticated. There would have been elements of them then going out and hunting and probably all eating together. Granted, they would be eating scraps, but those scraps were probably good for the dogs at the time. But there would have been a social element of that, I think. I don't think that they would have been going, right, we've hunted this bison over here. Wait a second, because we're going to have to put it in a bowl before we give it to you, and then we name you all by name. And do you know, or like, right, I'm eating this, there's the bone, and the dog's eating around them. Okay, we don't know that for sure. Or that's me just imagining that would have been how it is. But yeah, I do feel like food should be more like it is for us as humans. There should be more of a social side to it, and it shouldn't always be limited to just always being, not even always being healthy. My dog's like every now and then get a chicken McNugget. We're out in the car, they get a McNugget. But again, that's going to be varying on the dog. I wouldn't say give that to every dog, because some dogs might not stomach that. But from a social element, we're all eating together, and it's that social kind of interaction. And I think that that's something we miss massively.
I like that.
So how important would it be when we've got dogs pushing on in their years? How do we tackle their nutrition?
So very often, older dogs, there's a conception of lowering the protein as the dog gets older. And there's actually no evidence that shows that should be the case. And I just think that's a way of a lot of dog food companies, like, again, putting a label on the front, special senior dog food, and putting less nutrition into the bag. So almost charging more for special dog food, giving you more protein. I think it's the conception of protein creates energy, and that's not always the case. We know that carbohydrates can actually transfer to energy, and actually for dogs, they transfer fats into energy as well. So like really heavy working dogs. So if you were looking at some of the dogs and again, there's studies on this, dogs that are running like the huskies and things in some of the coldest climates that are doing what they do and going over mass miles or at super speeds. A lot of their diet is made up of like quite high contents of fat. So for me, protein should still stay at a decent level. I would be saying like you still want it at sort of 60% plus. I would be thinking about, for elderly dogs, adding things like your glucosamine chondroitin, but I would be wanting to do that earlier on as well. I would almost be wanting to tackle it, being proactive rather than reactive. So making sure I was doing that prior, particularly if you've got dogs that are like sports dogs and things like that. But again, that is when I would definitely be thinking about the social side, because I would want my dogs to be having like really comforting stuff at that age. I would be wanting, as they get older, to have those really nice moments with me and things like that. So yeah, I wouldn't be massively changing the diet. I would be thinking about my dog's weight. So you might have to lower diet slightly, as in calories, but I wouldn't be lowering protein.
Okay. And I would imagine we'd be thinking about the same lines, not so much exactly like the older dog. Puppies, what should their diet really be like?
So puppies need to have higher calcium and phosphorus. So this is where raw feeding does get a bit tricky. People that are raw feeding puppies, because you need to make sure you are making sure there is enough calcium and enough phosphorus, especially because puppies can't hold nutrients. So their diets really do need to be balanced. So like my dogs, as they get older, I don't necessarily balance every single meal. I might balance their meals throughout, over a couple of days, should we say. But puppies really do need every diet balanced. But I would be making sure that whatever you're feeding them is a puppy specific food. So it's got the higher levels of calcium and phosphorus. Or if you are feeding raw, make sure you are doing your research that you're hitting every single quota that you need to within every meal, especially if you've got breeds of dogs like, your big breeds, so like shepherds and anything bigger, because they're going to have a lot more growing, they're going to have big growth spurts. The other thing I would say with puppies is when you read your bag of food, people get hung up on the amount they have to feed their dog. Your puppy might have growth spurts. So if you're having, suddenly your puppy's gone through sleeping through the night and then they're suddenly waking up in the night, very often that to me says that they're getting hungry. So I would be giving them a little bit more throughout that period. It doesn't mean necessarily forever. We don't want to make fat dogs, but because that could be counterproductive. But in that puppy stage and through adolescence, I think lots of dogs get really hungry, and I would nurture that. I would give food when they need it, because it might be that there's a growth spurt and things like that.
And then when they hit adolescence, people struggle knowing when should the diet change and how much more should they give. What would your advice be there? We spoke about puppies and the elderly.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about the in-between.
So adolescents, similar to like what I just said, I would be making sure I feed the dog in front of me, because I think adolescence is where weight falls off of them. I think it's that gangly stage, and I don't think that I wouldn't be panicking, oh God, I'm going to make my dog fat. If they are looking skinny, up it a little bit and go for feeding, like adding things like your sardines and things like that, so that there are elements of fats. Certain nuts as well are really good to add in certain fats through different nuts that are, you wouldn't feed huge amounts, but like walnuts and things like that can be really, really good for good fats. I wouldn't massively it's really difficult to say, because again, it varies on breed of when you would switch your food over. But generally speaking, I would want to be giving that extra calcium and phosphorus all the way up until my dog's kind of is fully grown and matured enough, because we don't want to prevent any growth before that. Adolescence as well is a good time to start adding like your glucosamine chondroitin and collagen type things, because like I said, I almost want to keep that good before it gets bad when they get older. So it's at that point that I would start to think about, if I'm feeding a diet that is not high enough in, how can I supplement that, either via natural sources or you move and things like that do their own. There's lots of different ranges out there that you can add to to your dog's diet to make it more beneficial. But yeah, I would be saying make sure you're feeding your dog to what they look like, because like Cash, my Malinois, because of his energy level being what he is and going through adolescence, keeping weight on him is like, and so I have fed him up, and I'm glad I have, because he is starting to mature a little bit now. But I think if I would have laid, oh God, I'm going to make him fat and worried, he would be skinny little rake now, bless him. So I think you need to feed them as and when they need it. And I think some behaviours come from hunger. I do think that, again, that control thing, I think that through puppyhood and adolescence, we see lots of behaviours that are hunger in our dogs. And if any of you have ever been hungry, you know what that's like.
Yeah, nobody wants to be hungry. That's not good.
I don't even know what feeling hungry feels like. So I think a lot of problems can also arise with certain types of foods, because can certain types of foods cause dogs to be more aroused?
Oh, see, this is tricky, and this is where sometimes, again, people think higher protein makes dogs more hyper. So people will avoid things like a raw food or a like a higher meat content diet, because they think it's going to make their dogs hyper. And that, again, isn't the case. You're probably going to see more hyperactivity in the dog foods that are full with lots of fillers. And that's because then you sometimes look down the list of ingredients and you've got all sorts of random words that are a little bit like, some of them, if you research them, are a bit like numbers for kids. So yes, there are certain foods that can definitely make dogs more hyper, but I would be saying it's not your foods that have a good quality high meat content. And I will say good quality meat, because yes, arguably, again, if we're feeding a raw food diet and the meat quality is not great, yes, you could then run into that kind of issue of, is there going to be more issue than not? But it's one of those that actually just poor quality diet is probably going to hinder your dog's behavior, again, because of that microbiome and so on.
Okay. And when we talk about good quality meat, is it true that turkey is better than chicken?
Really, that's it. Obviously chicken is higher in allergens, so if you do have a dog that suffers with allergies, then chicken and beef are your two that you would avoid more, because they're higher in allergens. But they both have various different nutrients, so again, looking at that diversity, I would be wanting to feed, ideally with a healthy dog that can take those allergens. I'd want to feed the two for various different things. So I suppose in some respects turkey's slightly easier to digest, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a better meat. But again, that's going to boil down to quality, because if we're buying really cheap meat, cheap chicken, as opposed to the farmer down the road selling his free range healthy chickens that have been living out on the farm, there is going to be a difference in that, I suppose.
Okay, because I'm hearing far too many clients, or new clients, where they have been told in the past that turkey is far more better than chicken, and that feeding chicken, the allergens, you're absolutely correct there, because a lot of people can't feed their dogs chicken, otherwise they just get their dogs flapping their ears all day long. Yeah. Yeah, and I've had to learn the hard way myself.
Yeah,
too.
I've got one of those as well.
Yeah. So it's a minefield, isn't it, when we're talking about nutrition? A huge minefield. And I think a lot of it's going to be trial and error for some people, unless they're educated like yourself to understand the ins and outs of it. Dawn, thank you for coming along today. This has been absolutely brilliant.
I think this is probably the quietest I've been on a podcast, because I'm just so engrossed in what you're saying and taking everything in. Because I love it. Thank you.
Oh, I've loved it. It's been good fun.
It's an eye opener. It's interesting. It's important.
I could go on about this for hours and hours. So, like, we need to do a part 2. I'm there. We could do that.
There are, I think so too, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
And I think that will definitely happen if you're up for it.
Definitely.
So just want to thank you once again for coming. Dawn, if people wanted to get in touch with you for the services that you provide, how can they do that?
So they can find me on my Facebook page, which is Pawsitive Canine, or they can find me via the Dog Geeks. So again, we're on Facebook and the online platform that's there as well.
Thank you. Please, everybody, go hit that submit button, press the likes, so you don't miss any of the upcoming podcasts. Until we meet again, it's goodbye from myself, Colin Spence, Samantha Wayland, and Dawn. Bye for now.